everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for a fireside chat in honor of Nelson Mandela Day. Joining me today is my colleague from South Africa, David Reiersgord. I'll allow him to introduce himself in just a second. Before doing so, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Hernando Sevilla Garcia, and I am a Senior Diversity Relations Manager here at IES Abroad. I work specifically to increase the number of underrepresented students that are studying abroad with a specific focus on minority serving institutions. And once again, today I am thrilled to join my colleague David from South Africa in our center in Cape Town for this conversation that I'm also personally incredibly excited about. So with that, I'll go ahead and let David introduce himself to you all.
Thanks very much, Fernando. Hi, everyone. My name is David Reiersgord. I'm the interim center director here in Cape Town. I am originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, but I have been living in South Africa permanently since 2013, working first in universities here in Cape Town and then into international education with IES Abroad in 2018.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction, David, and then we'll go ahead and get right into it. And so actually before sharing, I just want to, or before getting started with the questions, and as David and I were preparing for this conversation and this fireside chat, I shared with him how back in, let's see, maybe 2016, I think it was 2017, I got the opportunity to travel to Cape Town to visit two friends that were studying abroad there. And I was just sharing with David how, if I could describe that trip in one word, it would be magical. And as we got to talking about how truly South Africa and a city like Cape Town and really the history of this country is, it truly is magical. And I think through today's conversation, you all will get a little bit of an insight and learn a little bit more about this fascinating place in the world through the image of Nelson Mandela, in celebration of his life, in honor of his legacy. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you, David, was, can you provide or what was the socio-political context in the South Africa that Mandela grew up in? So before getting into, Mandela as a figure, can you provide us with some historical context?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to start as well, because it helps to put into context the kind of world, like you said, Mandela grew up in, but also the kind of broader framework that the resistance structures, such as they were in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, were what they were responding to, and the sorts of tactics that they thought were best into resistance. So in the first half of the 20th century, South Africa was a colonial state, part of the British Empire. And if we back up to the end of the 19th century, to about 1889 or 1899 to 1901, 1902, we have what is the Second Anglo-Boer War, when the Afrikaner cultural groups, such as they were at that time, were in a fight with the British, which had erupted over what is called the Witwatersrand, where gold was discovered in 1886 and became obviously a key part of the wider British Empire that two groups went to war over. Although the Afrikaners had won in the first Anglo-Boer War, about 30 years prior to this, they faced a resounding defeat in the second Anglo-Boer War, which paved the way for white South African identity politics to be debated, discussed, imagined. And it is in this milieu that the idea of the Afrikaner identity, as it's popularly understood in relation to notions of nationalism or the system of apartheid, is formed. And it's formed, on one hand, in opposition to British cultural imperialism and British cultural influences, and of course, in response to the racial attitudes that long predate the 20th century in South Africa, all the way back to 1652. And it is in this context then that you have white South Africa being the main political actors because of the racial legislation, racial attitudes, and the racial architecture of the colonial project in South Africa on a bit of a swivel. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here and covering a lot of what is otherwise nuanced developments, but you have in some sense a more conservative wing of the white political institution that had a lot of Afrikaner nationalist undertones, which was largely led by an individual named J.B.M. Hertzog. And then on the more liberal side, or the other side of that proverbial spectrum, we have an individual named J.C. Smuts, who was much more internationalist in an outlook and much more focused in some ways on how South Africa related to Britain within the wider colonial empire. And it is within this context then that Nelson Mandela is born in 1918 and is one that he matures in, where a very overt colonial mindset, a very overt colonial landscape that understood in notions of hierarchy, subjugation, notions of racial superiority, that laid the groundwork for what would become later apartheid, when the Nationalist Party, to the surprise of many, won the elections in 1948 against the more liberal wing of the white political structures, and then began to implement with enthusiasm the structures of apartheid and the racial legislation that made it up.
Wow, thank you for that. Setting up the stage really for again the figure that really this fireside chat is focused on, and that is Nelson Mandela. And once again, in preparation for this conversation, David, a lot of I think that we discussed was this notion of really highlighting Mandela, a pre-prison Mandela. So I want to also highlight that the next couple of questions will focus on that, and really we'll go ahead and start getting into actually Mandela as a figure. And so can you share with us a brief biographical overview of Nelson Mandela's early days?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really important, as you said, Hernando, because to focus on Mandela in a pre-prison framework, because so much, at least for an international audience and for international students, the image of Nelson Mandela begins with prison and ends with the release of prison. And there are many important reasons why, and many important aspects of that timeline that need to be remembered and considered. And of course, what gets missed in this understanding is the pre-prison life of Nelson Mandela. So Mandela was born in a place called Mthatha, South Africa, and later grew up in a place called Qunu, which is where he was buried, his ancestral grounds. He was educated at the University of Fort Hare, which is in the Eastern Cape province. And the University of Fort Hare is a very famous university, especially in South Africa, in relation to Black liberation politics. And it is where the individuals who would have been involved prominently with resistance movements in South Africa and the formation and establishment of Black liberation politics would have crossed paths with one another at the University of Fort Hare. So some of the individuals that also attended University of Fort Hare are Robert Mangaliso Sebukwe. Robert Mugabe was an individual who was educated, spent some time at Fort Hare. Nelson Mandela spent a bit of time studying at Fort Hare, along with many other prominent figures, like I said, within the liberation movement of South Africa. He arrived in Johannesburg in the early 1940s because in the rural community that he was living, him and his friend, through some of the cultural customs, had arranged marriages arranged for them, and in an act of perhaps rebelliousness, in an act of individual identity and declaring who one is and who one wants to be, Mandela I say this in air quotes, fled the rural areas for Johannesburg. And part of what I think is really interesting in Mandela's pre-prison life is thinking about how his original name, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, which means a broken branch, a branch that's fallen off, and it in many ways symbolizes kind of a troublemaker or someone who bucks trends. And I think, again, in many ways, when we think of a pre-prison Mandela, this is in some ways perhaps a less grand instance of pushing back against the status quo, but we get an idea of what he's willing to sacrifice by, in air quotes, fleeing the community from an arranged marriage and going to Johannesburg in an effort to make a name for himself, get more involved, and become a lawyer. And Johannesburg, again, to this day, and during this time, is one of the places in South Africa that people go to from rural communities or from smaller towns in search of work and other opportunities. And many of the forms of employments that were allowed for a Black South African to engage in would have been in Johannesburg through mining and other forms of trade and lots of manual labor. And then you have instances of people like Nelson Mandela qualifying as a lawyer and working as an attorney in Johannesburg. And it's in Johannesburg where his life begins to change in the early 1940s. He meets individuals like Walter Sisulu, who was a very famous and prominent voice right up there with Oliver Tambo, Chris Hani, and other members, Cyril Ramaphosa, that helped shape the liberation movements that Mandela is the spearhead of. And later, after meeting Walter Sisulu and other members of the leadership, such as it was of the African National Congress at that time, he enrolls in the University of the Witwatersrand, where he was the only Black student at the time. And it's at this university then that he meets members of the South African Communist Party, notably Joe Slovo, and a lady named Ruth First. And Joe Slovo was the leader of the South African Communist Party for decades, and also, again, one of the more prominent voices within the liberation struggle, because the African National Congress, in addition to some labor union organizations, is part of an alliance with the South African Communist Party as a coalition that was essentially necessary for negotiating the transition to democracy. And it is in the Johannesburg when Mandela moves there in the early 1940s that some of these relationships begin to form. And he starts to meet more people in the Black resistance circles or just resistance circles more generally. Joe Slovo and Ruth First are white South Africans. And it's through these relationships that the ideas of non-racialism or Pan-Africanism are tossed around in Mandela's head, where the liberation struggle is divided, might be the wrong word, but is pivoting or swiveling on a swivel between a more Pan-Africanist orientation, which would have been headed by an individual I mentioned earlier, Robert Sobukwe, who was part of the Pan-Africanist Congress here in South Africa, and saw itself in more racialized terms than what the African National Congress eventually found itself when it articulated its vision of non-racialism. One of the more, again, continuing trends in Mandela's pre-prison early life, where he, again, isn't necessarily a troublemaker in that he's doing something wrong, but he's bucking the trend and pushing back against the status quo, such as it is I think illustrated in the formation of the African National Congress Youth League in 1944, which was, again, not necessarily a simple task. It involved persuading the leadership of the African National Congress to start to mobilize youth and an urbanizing youth in the 1940s, which started to coincide with the urbanization that was taking place as a result of World War II. South Africa would have participated or did participate in World War II on the side of the British, because at this time in the 1940s, it was still part of the Commonwealth. It would not be removed from the Commonwealth until 1960, when the Afrikaner nationalists, as part of their aspirations to be a self-sustaining nation, as it were, and I say that in air quotes, required moving away from the British Empire. And so in this environment, you have new identity formations taking place, new aspirations taking place, new political imaginations are opening up. And one of these is of a youth becoming politicized and being conscientiousized in ideas of racial liberation politics that were brought on by the system of apartheid that was implemented in 1948. So just a few years before that, Mandela and others formed the African National Congress Youth League, and that becomes a vehicle for a more mobilized politics in urban spaces and elsewhere, and became one of the engines for the Defiance campaign in the early 1950s, as well as what became known as the Freedom Charter, which is kind of the first document providing the political and ideological aspirations of what a non-racial South Africa would look like. And I think it's quite important to highlight that the non-racialist vision in South Africa was really championed out of Black liberation politics, and this idea that that non-racialism is not something that people just, even within liberation struggles, accepted. It was something that was debated and discussed and tossed around for quite a long time, particularly because of the influence of individuals like Joe Slovo that I mentioned earlier, and the South African Communist Party, and the co-option of liberation by not necessarily white instigators or white agitators, but the racialized atmosphere of the day involved being skeptical, or at least considering what are people's motivations to get involved. In addition to these, the more individualized political moments that Mandela was involved in, there's a couple of other instances that I think are also important to highlight about what perhaps could have been formative experiences for Mandela, but also for his involvement and motivation in the liberation struggle and the Youth League. And that was the two places one of the places where Nelson Mandela lived, which was a community called Sophia Town. And Sophia Town was a community, it's often compared to Harlem or a kind of eclectic, multiracial, mixed race community, where politicians like Mandela lived, musicians such as Hugh Masekela, writers such as Louis Nkosi, photographers such as, I'm forgetting his name now, but Nat Nakasa. So a very interesting space where the kind of who's who of South African, Black South African culture, politics, literature, and music was living. This community was demolished as part of the forced removals projects in the 1950s through things like the Group Areas Act, which redrew the South African map and created a white neighborhood and a Black neighborhood, and there were strict rules about where individuals could live. And also the Native Resettlement Act, which was a law that was used for the demolition of specific communities. And the demolition of Sophia Town was done in place for a whites-only suburb called Triumph, which is the Afrikaans word for triumph. So the symbolism of not only having a community that you live in and that other people live in demolished, but then symbolically representing some sort of triumph. This was, again, part of the broader forced removals campaign in South Africa, which saw more increased land dispossession, which is a theme of South African politics, and more racial subjugation and policing of movement and where one can live, a circumscribing of one's humanity. And it's in that period, the 1940s, and then the very busy period of the 1950s, when a vast majority of significant legislation from the National Party and as part of the apartheid infrastructure was enacted, that Mandela's political voice and political motivations become even stronger. And it is in that, with that background in mind, that he then starts to get closer to what we understand to be as the prison days.
Thank you very much for that. David. And now I know you did mention a couple of other figures in the decolonial movement, but one of the things that again in preparation we discussed was this Pan-African trip by Mandela. So, and you specifically in a course that we're going to speak about a little bit later, but you being able to illustrate Mandela's life before prison through African geography, which I think is a fascinating concept. And so that's specifically referring to Mandela's Pan-African trip, and in relation to other figures in the decolonial movement. So can you expand upon those two?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In the course that I teach about post-apartheid South African history and the idea of the Rainbow Nation, we look specifically at the pre-prison, one instance in pre-prison Mandela's life, which is a Pan-African tour he took in 1962. And just to kind of take a couple of steps back, on the 21st of March 1960 was what is known as the Sharkville Massacre, when members of the Pan-Africanist Congress, notably Robert Sobukwe, and others led a non-violent revolt against pass laws. And pass laws were in reference to legislation that everyone had an identity book that stated what their race was, where they could live, so on and so forth, and where they could work. And this was the pass revolt was against that. And this revolt turned incredibly violent. It's unfortunate. I'm not remembering exactly how many people were killed. I want to say 69 people were killed and over 100 were injured. And this was one of the more globally received events in apartheid South Africa, which caused a lot of outrage around the world, particularly because in the early 1960s and for some years since, much of the rest of the African continent was going through a decolonial period. And in South Africa, we see the opposite, where the colonial mindset or colonial attitude that many people were hoping was going into the dustbin of history was accelerating. And in response to the state's crackdown after the Sharkville Massacre, the declarations of state of emergency, the banning of all opposition political parties, and another example is there were no gatherings permitted between more than 3 people. So the state flexed its muscles and forced a lot of the resistance movements, all of the resistance movements, underground. And it is in this context of needing to go underground that Mandela and others helped to spearhead the idea of taking up armed resistance to the apartheid state, because Sharpeville had demonstrated that they were all too willing to use live force and kill people standing up for their rights and for their humanity. And so Mandela and others formed what is called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means the spear of the nation, and that refers to the military wing of the African National Congress. And in fully establishing the Umkhonto we Sizwe, Mandela takes a tour in 1962 of much of southern, central, eastern, western, and northern Africa. And I like to discuss this with students for 2 reasons. The first is that it really, again, shows a particular moment in not just South African history, but African history, where there's a decolonial enthusiasm and there is an aspiration, broad Pan-African aspiration about what it means to be free of the colonial administrations, and what that means for Black liberation politics and various liberation movements being able to now articulate visions of their countries that have not been in their hands and have not enabled them to participate. So I like to show that because it shows, again, the extent to what being underground meant, and some of the ideas involved with secrecy and kind of clandestine operations. And this is also taking place against the backdrop of the emerging Cold War, where a lot of the Soviet allied states would have had relationship. It would have been found in various parts of the African continent. And the threat of communism was used by the South African state as a as a way to drive people underground to imprison them, and as a way to get allies in the West, such as the United States or the United Kingdom. The other reason I like to discuss this trip with students is because it helps teach them a bit about African geography. And it's a subject I think all of us everywhere could know a bit more about, just to have a better sense of the world. But also in this case, for this course, this trip is about Pan-Africanism and this idea of not necessarily one Africa, but a solidarity between African countries, between African people. And in order to fully, I think, understand and appreciate that sense of Pan-Africanism, the literal and metaphorical lengths people were willing to go to help one another out, one needs to know where these countries are and who the people involved with them are. So the trip is magnificent. I mean, for any kind of trip, it covers a lot of ground. Like I said, it begins with flying from South Africa to Botswana, and these are not commercial flights. These are a little under the radar, so to speak. And from Botswana, he flew to Tanzania. From Tanzania, he flew to Uganda. And there's an instance in Uganda where Nelson Mandela is told to provide identity documents, and he's doing so to a Black individual in Khartoum. And this is the first of many little instances where Mandela reflects on the face of authority in other African countries, where he later in his trip, he notices for the first time he's on a plane with a Black pilot. And he initially admonishes himself for feeling worried about that, because of the way he had taken in some of the colonial attitudes and some of the racialized attitudes, but quickly sheds that. And in Khartoum, he has a funny exchange with his identity documents about his race and the idea of a Black guy needing to have a certain kind of documentation to enter other African countries. Means he's able to enter a country a lot easier than the white individual he was traveling with. And so from Uganda, from Khartoum, he goes to Accra in Ghana. And then from there, he goes to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia for the Pan-African Freedom Movement for East, Southern, and Central Africa, where the Ethiopian leader, Haile Selassie, was holding a conference about, again, the emerging decolonial tide in Africa, where leaders such as Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, I am forgetting Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, were again seizing a moment and riding a wave. From Ethiopia, though, Nelson Mandela then goes to Egypt and discusses walking around the different museums in Cairo and getting a sense of deep African history and the idea of kings and queens, and how some of the great artworks that Africans were producing when Europeans were perhaps a little further behind or elsewhere on a cultural scale. Egypt leads him to Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, and Mali, where he meets other liberation leaders, military generals, politicians who advise him about, perhaps, have you thought about this idea related to Pan-Africanism? Or, perhaps you ANC guys are a bit too quick to dispel this notion of Pan-Africanism and this idea of non-racialism. We're not too sure about it. And again, it really is an interesting, these little instances are interesting for getting a sense of liberation politics from a continental scale, and what these different struggles mean, what are the local contexts, what are the particular circumstances people are resisting. So from North Africa, he then starts to make his way back to Ethiopia and South Africa by first going to Guinea. And from there, he goes to Sierra Leone, stops in Liberia, stops in Senegal, meets Leopold Senghor, flies to London to check up with Walter Sisulu Oliver Tambo, about one of the ANC's international offices in London. And then from there, back to Ethiopia and back to South Africa. And again, it's like I said, this trip is a great way for students to get a sense of African geography, to learn a bit more about who are the broad major players in liberation circles within an African context. And again, to get a sense of what Pan-Africanism means and what does a broader identity mean beyond a national identity, limiting yourself to a national identity or thinking more broadly, because as I'm sure we'll discuss now, the course is about the ways in which national identity does or doesn't clash with personal identity. And again, what does it mean to think more broadly and to do so from an African liberation perspective?
On that note, David, I think what's fascinating about the next couple questions is that we get insight into one, really the part of the curriculum at the Cape Town Center, a specific course that is without a doubt one of our most popular courses throughout our entire organization, and that course being Narrative of the Rainbow Nation, which of course you teach, and I know you've touched a little bit upon this concept, but in discussion with colleagues earlier this week, one of our colleagues, Gretchen, mentioned how, due to Nelson Mandela Day, the Biden-Harris administration came out with a statement regarding Mandela Day, and then we got to talking about this concept in the United States about the melting pot. Right, the melting pot in the United States, and now to kind of juxtapose it to that concept of the Rainbow Nation, I wanted to ask you, how does the course that you teach, Narrative of the Rainbow Nation, explore this very concept of the Rainbow Nation, and how may that be similar or different from the melting pot in the United States?
Yeah, no, it's another one of the interesting ways I think that the relationships and the overlap and even the contrast between the United States and South Africa is articulated, is done so through these metaphors and through the ways in which they, rightly or wrongly, shape national identity. So the idea of the Rainbow Nation starts to emerge in the early 1990s. I don't know if it was the Archbishop Desmond Tutu who coined it, or if it was Nelson Mandela, or so on and so forth. But in the early 1990s, I want to say 1991, there's a quote by Desmond Tutu where he mentions being in a room with white South Africans and black South Africans and colored South Africans and Indian South Africans. And he says, hold up your hands, look at all the different colors. You guys are the rainbow people of God. And it really is a stunning metaphor, I think. It's a very poignant metaphor as well. And we look at these, in the course, we explore what does a rainbow mean. And by this, I try to get very literal with the students. When we think about to see a rainbow, what does it mean? What is the broader context that, no pun intended, precipitates a rainbow? And what other ways can we view rainbows in? And so I within that discussion, we think about the relationship between national identity and individual identity. Does the aspirations of a country, particularly South Africa, the democratic aspirations, align with how people see themselves? How does South African identity interact with those aspirations when, for almost 350 years, the concept of a South African national identity was very contested, very policed, very racialized, in a number of ways. And so I'm of the opinion that the Rainbow Nation the rainbow is a very interesting metaphor, whereas to South Africans, it's I understand it to be mocked, it's made fun of, it's pushed back against, it's understood these days now to be somewhat negative in terms of the failed aspirational qualities that it symbolizes. Nevertheless, I again take this metaphor and break it down as a way to try to capture the spectrum of opinions on South Africa from the perspective of the Rainbow Nation. So we look at the concept of a rainbow in four ways. One of them is the chaotic origins. So a thunderstorm or storms are in theory a somewhat chaotic event. And a rainbow that can be a product of that is a reminder that sometimes beautiful things have chaotic origins. And this is something I remind the students, that the beauty of the aspirations of a liberated South Africa, of a democratic South Africa, of a free South Africa, it's a very beautiful thing. It's an intoxicating image, and it's something I think in the US, or at least in the West, we cling to a lot more than we do when we think of other things about South Africa. And again, that beauty stems from something very turbulent, very violent, and very impactful. Another thing we look at when we think about rainbows and national identity is how rainbows challenge perspective. As a kid, when we look at a rainbow, we're often told that there's a pot of gold at the end of it. And part of the fun is that you can actually never really tell where the end is. And so something like the end of apartheid and the beginning of democracy is a very interesting moment to think about narrative and what constitutes a beginning, what constitutes an end. Do they perhaps bleed into one another? And so when we think about how rainbows challenge perspective, we get a sense of how some people might be in a town might actually be able to see a rainbow, whereas other people on another side or somewhere else might not be able to see it. And so how does the fact that the Rainbow Nation is visible to some but not everyone impact how equitable the democratic aspirations have been? Then, of course, rainbows, the third way we look at them is that rainbows are transient. They don't last forever, and there are potentially multiple rainbows. They come and go, they require the right conditions, they fade away, which then feeds into the final way I like to engage students about rainbows, which is ultimately that they're an illusion. And that's the main thing that I like to drive home, is that national identities, national sentiments are obviously important. And I don't mean to say that they don't mean anything, because they really do. And, when you apply for a visa or travel internationally, you really get a sense for how much that stuff matters. And so when we think of something like a rainbow as an illusion, it reminds us that these aspirations are only really as powerful as we allow them to be. And if they're an illusion, it reminds us to be skeptical, and not in a contrarian way, but to be skeptical and to be critical, ultimately, of the aspirations that countries prescribe for people. I think of something like the American dream, that, again, is a similar kind of illusion, that it's a great thing to aspire for, but it's also important to be skeptical of something like that, because, again, it's not attainable to everyone, and perhaps it's attainable to no one. But if we're not skeptical of these things, if we don't remind ourselves that they're illusions, then we take them too seriously, to the point of not recognizing that it's also something that we have to cultivate and that we have to take care of. And so when we think again about the idea of the melting pot in the United States and how that relates to or contrasts with the Rainbow Nation, is what I understand the melting pot to be. It's been a while since I've lived in the US, but the melting pot to me symbolizes a kind of oneness or a singularity, where you have a bunch of different ingredients that makes a stew. And in that sense, one's more, maybe perhaps one's cultural background, one's language, one's ethnicity, so on and so forth, is diminished or subdued in favor of the one, the whole, the American. And that's something that I think is very interesting about the United States, is that you could be from Johannesburg and be a Xhosa person or an Afrikaans person, but you spend enough time in America, people will say you're an American. And that's that melting pot-ness, that you become an American perhaps at the expense of, or for other reasons, at some of the other elements that you are. The Rainbow Nation, in contrast, it is yes about the singular image of a rainbow, but perhaps what's different about it is that one can actually see the rainbow, and a melting pot's contents are hidden. And so when you are able to see the rainbow, you recognize that it's not possible if one piece was missing. So to me, maybe, I guess it's a more holistic image, in that it really reflects this idea of the whole being made possible by each individual participant. And again, whether that is a reality that people feel in South Africa or that people live day to day is a very vexed question, and a very important one. And again, part of why I tend to end with that fourth way of seeing the rainbow as an illusion, because I think being skeptical of the stories a nation tells itself to itself, about itself, is important for us to think about, whether they align with who we think we are or who we see ourselves as. What are our aspirations as South Africans? What are our aspirations as Americans? Do they align with how the country is understood? And I think what you start to gain from that is an appreciation for how delicate national identity is and how complicated it is, how contested it is, and how important it is to, again, not how simply we just take on these identities, and we don't often think about them as much as we should. And in the process, I think we might be able to arrive at a better understanding of what these mean if we learn to question them a bit more. So that's a bit of what we do in the course with rainbows, and looking at different events in South Africa, and if they reflect one of these four ways of thinking about rainbows. If they don't, how do they interact? And if it's multiple, what does that tell us? And it does tend to generate, I think, a lot of interesting conversations when students see me put up pictures of rainbows and have them think seriously about what are we seeing, and light being refracted, and so on and so forth. So I tend to get quite literal with the metaphor, but for noble reasons.
I gotta tell you, that is a fantastic analogy in academia, in action. That's fascinating, and definitely on a personal level, my history undergrad major is certainly kind of like all of a sudden being reactivated. Not that it isn't every day, because I truly think, and an example of what you're sharing really is, now we're not only talking about South Africa, but I think you just juxtaposed brilliantly some very similar yet different concepts with the United States. And on that note, David, there is, I think, a tension here between these two positions: the international reception of Mandela versus the local reception of Mandela. Can you expand upon this for us?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's important to consider. The tension, I think, between this is that the international image of Nelson Mandela, of the prison Mandela, there's a couple of iconic images that we've seen that people are perhaps familiar with, even if they don't readily recognize it. But it's one of Mandela looking out from a prison window. It was recreated when Obama and his family visited Robben Island. It was that same picture was recreated. There's the other one of him leaving Victor Verster prison in Paarl, not too far from here, with his hand raised, with his wife at the time, Winnie Madikizela Mandela. That's another famous image. So you get this longing in prison, and then this victorious, triumphant hand being raised from that. There's that popular image, and again, those are very important aspects of Mandela. But I think the international understanding of him and his life is simplistic, and not in a judging sense, but it's simplistic in the idea that Mandela is a very complicated individual, despite being one of the great figures of 20th and even to some extent 21st century history. And for me, being a white guy from Minnesota and not being a South African, there's very little risk in championing Mandela as somebody who should be emulated, or whose example serves as something that should be followed. And I don't say that to be critical of people who do see Mandela as that figure, but again, it's an illusion. And I think through being skeptical or questioning some of these things, you get a more well-rounded image of him that I think South Africans engage with much more readily, because they're more aware of it. And a lot of this is again the result of the reality that the aspirations that Mandela championed and that were piggybacked off of him, and the kind of caricature of him had a direct impact on South African lives. And there are ideas about whether the transition to democracy should have gone one way or should have gone another way. There are ideas about whether economic policies contributed to the increasing of inequality, so on and so forth, that again show how so often the aspirations that one stands for, that one subscribes to, are very difficult to put into practice. But again, what's fascinating about Mandela is that he still tried to make it work, and that's that complexity that I think is really important for international audiences to not lose sight of. That obviously, I mean, it should go without saying that any individual is not perfect, and in a revolutionary context with armed struggles and liberation rhetoric that can agitate certain people or not. I mean, we think about the idea of a freedom fighter, the idea of Mandela as a terrorist, as we discussed, Anando, which is what the U.S. government, in a certain way, had him categorized as until 2008. And I don't think that that's the same as other kinds of lists that the government has. But people tend to view Mandela in very stark ways, and that could either be as a freedom fighter or as a terrorist, or as a saint or as a fallen angel, so on and so forth. And those are some of those positions, like I think being a terrorist, are a little bit more ridiculous than others, but it shows how I think we often, perhaps in the struggle to talk about greatness and a figure as powerful and towering as Mandela is, even in death, it's perhaps a habit of ours. I don't know if it's something about human nature, but it's a tendency of ours to talk about greatness in very simple terms, perhaps because we're kind of in awe of it, and we struggle to find words that capture that nuance or those contradictions. And that's, again, part of, I mean, ultimately it's a human being, and I think it's really about trying to keep in mind complexity and contradiction and embracing it rather than trying to repackage it or reformulate it.
Thank you, David. And so to conclude this conversation, I think, and maybe before I go ahead with this last and final question, we've discussed the notion of pre-prison Mandela. We've discussed the juxtaposition between concepts like the Rainbow Nation in South Africa and the melting pot in the United States. We've also talked a little bit about the different perspectives or the different receptions that Mandela has received in the local context versus abroad. And seeing as students from the United States are going to the IES Abroad Cape Town Center and taking classes like these. I wanted to ask you, David, what do you think is Nelson Mandela's legacy for students, specifically for that student demographic, and whether that is for, students from the United States going to South Africa, or for those students that are at UCT, born and raised in South Africa, born and raised in the context of post-apartheid South Africa. What do you think is Mandela's legacy for students?
I think the legacy is a continuation of what we were just discussing now about complication, contestation, contradiction. But also, I think I tend to see Mandela's example as one of revolution. And perhaps that's a word that evokes a kind of a spectacle, or there's perhaps popular images in history that our mind jumps to when we think of revolution. It requires a spectacle, or that there must be some sort of like epochal moment, almost like something in the geology where we can see a clear definitive change between one epoch and another. And yes, I think there's reasons for that, and there's value to that. And I think one of the takeaway legacies of Mandela is that revolutions don't also have to be as spectacular. Not that the South African one wasn't. I think it certainly was. And there's images of snaking voting queues that attest to this and reflect a kind of South African society that had never really been seen before. A society that had been cut into very rigid shapes, cut into very stark black and white terms. Upon the release of Mandela and the conclusion of the transition and the crowning of the post-apartheid period, the beginning of the democratic government, begins with people twisting in very strange shapes and snaking shapes, which again I think really cut across that history of rigid racism, violence, those stark terms that again we often discuss very big things in, and what Mandela's example, I think, for students, the legacy of it is that it shows that great changes take a lot of time, and great changes can unfold from smaller beginnings, or from beginnings that people might not necessarily understand or agree with. And Mandela was not someone who everyone agreed with, or someone who everyone understood, but as a leader, and as a leader of a country during a particular moment, his was more principled perhaps than other world leaders that are in positions of power these days, and the kind of courage it takes to go against the grain. Because again, the idea of a non-racial South Africa is not one that people accept wholesale when it was first proposed, when it was negotiated, and certainly today, it's something that is a topic of conversation all the time in South Africa for a lot of very good reasons. And Mandela's example again reminds us of conviction and principle and believing in something better, believing in change. We can't change something that we don't think is capable of changing. And I think Mandela reminds us that something that could have so torturous and so violent and so bloody of a history of South Africa is still worth saving. And that, I think, is a really remarkable thing to try to grapple with and to think about when trying to understand what the legacy of this individual is. Because that's just my answer. I can imagine a South African on the street might say something else, a student at UCT might say another thing, and perhaps an international student would say something else. And so it's, again, that I think the diversity of potential perspectives is a testament, again, to the magnitude of his character, his vision, and what that means in a polarized and often challenging world today.
David, thank you very, very much for that. And before wrapping up, really, I just wanted to say, really just thank you again. I think on a professional level, it's been fascinating to get to know you a little bit more throughout this process. On a personal level, as someone that's been to South Africa, but quite frankly, didn't know the complex history, or yet alone through the eyes of Mandela. I've learned so much today in the preparation to this. And lastly, really just to commend you, because I truly believe that as educators, we have this unique role in society, and clearly you do this fantastic job with our students, and makes me want to be IES Abroad Cape Town student, specifically in the course that we discuss today. So again, thank you so much, David, for your time. Thank you all for joining us today for this fireside chat. And again, in honor of Nelson Mandela Day, we hope you are able to take a look at this fireside chat and certainly learn something new, as I have throughout this entire conversation.
And thanks very much, Fernando. I really enjoyed this, and I hope everyone does too. I echo all of your sentiments. Thanks very much.